The moment you start testing the person you love, it usually means your heart already knows something your mind refuses to accept. I never imagined I would become the kind of husband who secretly parked 2 houses away from his own home just to listen through a baby monitor. But after months of watching my marriage slowly disappear behind tired smiles and quiet dinners, I no longer trusted what I saw with my own eyes. My name is Ethan Brooks, and for 3 years I believed Adrian Carter was the safest place I would ever call home. He had never been the loud type. He wasn't the kind of alpha who filled every room with jokes or grand speeches. Adrian showed love in quieter ways, bringing me coffee before sunrise, fixing the loose cabinet door without being asked, warming my side of the bed before I climbed in after a late shift. Those little things used to make me feel cherished. Then Noah was born, and somewhere between midnight feedings, pediatric appointments, unpaid parental leave, and endless exhaustion, those little moments simply stopped. At first, I blamed the adjustment. Every new parent was overwhelmed. That was normal. I told myself we were just tired. I repeated those words so many times they almost sounded true. But weeks became months, and the silence inside our home grew heavier than the sleepless nights. Adrian stayed longer at the office, even though his company allowed him to work remotely several days each week. When he finally came home, he looked worn out, yet distant in a way that sleep alone couldn't explain. He kissed Noah's forehead every evening without fail, but when his eyes met mine, something invisible seemed to close between us. We still shared the same kitchen, the same bedroom, the same last name, yet somehow it felt like we had become polite roommates raising the same little boy. Friends kept telling us that the first year after having a baby tested every marriage. They laughed about diapers, messy kitchens, and forgetting anniversaries. I laughed with them because it was easier than admitting I couldn't remember the last time Adrian looked at me the way he once had. Even simple conversations became careful exchanges about grocery lists, daycare wait lists, electric bills, and doctor's appointments. We discussed schedules with perfect teamwork while completely avoiding everything that actually mattered. Every night after putting Noah to sleep, I would sit in the nursery for a few extra minutes, listening to the soft rhythm of his breathing. It became the only room in the house that still felt peaceful. Sometimes I wondered if babies could sense loneliness before they learned words. Noah always smiled whenever Adrian entered the room, reaching his tiny hands toward his father with complete trust. Watching them together reminded me that Adrian was still a wonderful dad. That somehow made everything even more confusing. If he still loved our son so completely, where had the love for me gone? I searched for answers everywhere except the one place that frightened me most. I checked our bank statements, even though I hated myself for doing it. Nothing unusual. I noticed he smiled at his phone sometimes, but every message I happened to glimpse was about work. I asked if everything was okay, and every single time he answered with the same gentle smile. "I'm just tired, Ethan." Eventually those 4 words became walls I couldn't climb over. One rainy Thursday afternoon, after another dinner spent exchanging fewer than 20 sentences, I stood at the kitchen sink staring out the window while Noah played with colorful blocks on the floor. Adrian quietly packed his laptop into his briefcase for another early morning meeting. He paused beside Noah, brushed a hand through our son's soft blonde hair, whispered something I couldn't hear, then walked upstairs without saying goodnight to me. I realized I had been holding my breath. That was the exact moment an impossible thought slipped into my mind. Maybe he was waiting for me to leave. Maybe the distance wasn't temporary anymore. Maybe the marriage I kept trying to save had already ended, and I was the last person willing to admit it. The next morning, while Adrian poured himself coffee before work, I forced a calm smile onto my face and quietly said, "I think Noah and I are going to spend the weekend at my mom's place. She keeps asking for more time with him." Adrian looked up for only a second before giving a slow nod. "That sounds nice. Drive safely." Nothing more. No hesitation. No request for us to stay. No promise that he'd miss us. Just 4 ordinary words delivered with perfect kindness. My chest tightened so sharply I almost couldn't answer. I smiled anyway, kissed Noah's tiny forehead, and carried him upstairs to finish packing, already knowing I wasn't going to my mother's house at all. I drove across town with Noah asleep in his car seat, his tiny stuffed rabbit tucked beneath one arm, until I reached the quiet neighborhood where my mother lived. I slowed in front of her driveway, but never turned in. Instead, I pulled over a few streets away beneath a line of tall maple trees whose leaves whispered softly in the afternoon breeze. My phone buzzed almost immediately. It was my mother asking how far away we were. I swallowed the lump in my throat and typed that something had come up and I would bring Noah another day. She replied with a heart emoji and reminded me not to skip lunch. I stared at that simple message longer than I should have. Even strangers seemed to notice whether I had eaten. I wondered when Adrian had stopped asking. Noah woke with a sleepy little yawn, blinking his bright blue eyes at me before breaking into the innocent smile that never failed to soften my heart. I lifted him from his seat, kissed the top of his head, and carried him into the small furnished apartment I had quietly rented for one night earlier that morning. It was only 10 minutes from our house, close enough that I could return at any moment if something happened, but far enough that no familiar neighbor would notice my car. The apartment was plain, with beige walls, an old gray sofa, and a tiny dining table beside a single window. It felt temporary, almost invisible, exactly what I needed. While Noah crawled across a soft blanket on the floor, chasing a plastic giraffe, I unpacked the diaper bag and reached for the second phone hidden beneath a stack of baby clothes. Months earlier, when we had set up Noah's nursery, we had purchased a high-quality baby monitor that connected securely to our phones. Adrian still believed I only used it while cooking dinner or folding laundry downstairs. He had no idea I had installed the application on an older phone as a backup after the first one froze during a storm. I charged the device, connected my headphones, and placed it carefully beside me on the couch. The tiny screen showed Noah's empty crib exactly as we had left it that morning. Sunlight filtered through the pale curtains, casting familiar patterns across the wooden floor. Everything looked ordinary, almost painfully ordinary. I checked the time. Adrian usually returned home around 6:30. Until then, there was nothing to do except wait. Waiting turned out to be far more difficult than I expected. Every few minutes I convinced myself this was childish and unfair. Adrian had never given me a reason to believe he would intentionally hurt me. Maybe he was simply overwhelmed. Maybe I was allowing loneliness to invent problems that did not exist. More than once I reached for my keys, ready to drive home, apologize for acting irrationally, and pretend none of this had happened. Then I remembered the empty expression on his face when I told him Noah and I were leaving for the weekend. That memory stopped me every time. As evening settled outside, I fed Noah mashed sweet potatoes and applesauce before rocking him gently to sleep in the portable crib beside the bed. The apartment became almost completely silent except for the soft hum of the air conditioner. My eyes never left the second phone. At 6:28, the nursery camera flickered slightly as motion activated the live feed. My pulse instantly quickened. The front door downstairs had opened. I heard distant footsteps echo through the hallway of our home, followed by the familiar sound of keys being placed inside the ceramic bowl near the entrance. Adrian was home. For several long moments, nothing happened. I could hear only the quiet creak of floorboards and the faint rustle of his jacket being removed. Then the footsteps began climbing the stairs, slow and unusually heavy, until they stopped outside Noah's bedroom. The doorknob turned. Adrian stepped into the nursery alone, still wearing his office shirt with the sleeves rolled neatly to his forearms. He stood perfectly still beside the crib, staring at the empty mattress. His shoulders sank in a way I had never seen before, and after a silence so long it made my heart ache, he reached down, picked up Noah's little blue blanket, held it carefully against his chest, closed his eyes, and released the deepest, most exhausted breath I had ever heard. My fingers tightened around the old phone until they hurt, afraid that even the smallest movement might somehow shatter the fragile connection between us. Adrian remained beside Noah's crib without speaking. The silence stretched for several seconds, heavy enough to make my own breathing sound too loud inside the headphones. Then he slowly lowered himself into the rocking chair where I usually sat during late-night feedings. He kept Noah's little blue blanket folded carefully across his lap, running his thumb absent-mindedly over the soft fabric. I had expected relief. I had expected indifference. I had even prepared myself to hear him say that the house finally felt peaceful without me asking questions all the time. Instead, what I saw was a man who looked completely exhausted. His tie was still hanging loosely around his neck, his hair slightly out of place from a day that had clearly lasted too long. He leaned forward, rested his elbows on his knees, and covered his face with one hand before finally speaking. His voice was so quiet that I instinctively turned the volume higher. "Hey, little buddy," he whispered toward the empty crib with a tired smile that disappeared almost as quickly as it appeared. "Your dad thinks I stopped loving him." My heartbeat stumbled. I stared at the tiny screen, convinced I had misunderstood him. Adrian looked toward the family photo sitting on the bookshelf beside the crib. It had been taken when Noah was 3 months old. I remembered complaining that my hair looked messy in the picture. Adrian had insisted it was his favorite photograph because we were all smiling without realizing the camera had already started counting down. He reached over and gently picked up the frame. "I wish you were old enough to tell him that I have." "Never stopped," he said quietly. "I wish you could explain it better than I ever seemed to." Tears blurred my vision before I even realized they had formed. Every conversation we had shared over the past several months flashed through my mind. Every time I had asked if something was wrong. Every time he answered that he was only tired. Had he been trying to tell me more without knowing how? Adrian placed the picture back exactly where it belonged before letting out another slow breath. "He thinks I do not notice when he cries in the shower because the water is running." His voice cracked so slightly that someone else might not have heard it. But I do. My chest tightened until it almost hurt. I remembered those mornings. I had believed the sound of the shower covered everything. I had convinced myself he never knew. Adrian closed his eyes for a moment. I know he smiles before he looks at me now because he is trying to decide whether I am going to smile back. He shook his head with quiet regret. "That is my fault." I felt my own memories rearranging themselves into something unfamiliar. The distance I had interpreted as rejection suddenly looked different through his eyes. Not coldness, not resentment, something heavier, something he was carrying alone. He stood and walked toward the window overlooking our backyard. The evening sunlight had almost disappeared, leaving only a warm orange glow across the nursery walls. "I thought if I could fix everything first, I could protect both of you from worrying." He gave a humorless laugh. "Turns out I only convinced the person I love most that he was facing it alone." My pulse quickened again. Fix what? What had he been trying to protect us from? Before I could gather another thought, his phone vibrated inside his pocket. He looked down at the screen without answering immediately. Whatever name appeared there caused every trace of warmth to disappear from his face. After several long seconds, he accepted the call, lowered his voice, and quietly said, "I told you not to contact me at the house. If Ethan ever finds out what is happening before everything is settled, I will never forgive myself." The voice on the other end of the call was too faint for me to understand, but Adrian listened without interrupting, his jaw tightening with every passing second. He walked slowly out of the nursery, and for one terrifying moment I thought I had lost the connection. Then I remembered the monitor microphone reached part of the upstairs hallway as well. His footsteps stopped just outside Noah's bedroom. "No," he said firmly. "Absolutely not. We agreed that nothing would happen until the paperwork was complete." Another pause. He rubbed his forehead as though fighting off a headache that had followed him for months. "I do not care how complicated it becomes. Ethan is not signing anything until I know every detail myself." My heart skipped. Signing what? I lowered the volume slightly, afraid the pounding in my ears would drown out his words. The person on the phone continued speaking. Adrian closed his eyes before answering again. You keep telling me there is no other option, but that is not good enough. Find another one. His voice never became angry. It became something worse. Tired. Deeply tired. He already thinks I am pulling away. If I tell him now and everything falls apart, I will have put him through months of fear for nothing. He listened again, then quietly replied, No, he does not know about the house. My breath caught. The house. We already had a house. Why would there be another one? Adrian slowly leaned against the hallway wall. It was supposed to be a surprise after Noah turned one. Somewhere quieter. A backyard big enough for him to run around without traffic 10 feet from the sidewalk. Ethan always says he wants a vegetable garden, even though every tomato plant he buys somehow dies before July. A faint smile crossed his face. He keeps pretending he does not care, but every spring he buys another one anyway. My eyes instantly drifted toward the tiny herb planter sitting on the apartment windowsill. Last April I had, in fact, killed another tomato plant. Adrian had teased me for days, promising next year would be different. I had completely forgotten that conversation. He had not. The inspection found structural problems. Adrian continued quietly. Everything stalled after that. Then the financing became more complicated because of the medical bills from Noah's birth, and I have been trying to solve it without worrying him. He fell silent once more. Until that moment, I had never realized how much of our savings had quietly disappeared during those first difficult weeks after Noah was born. We had insurance, but not everything had been covered. Adrian had always insisted we would recover financially. I believed him because I wanted to. Now another piece of the puzzle slid into place. He had not been disappearing because he wanted distance. He had been working longer hours because he was trying to carry more than I ever knew existed. The call continued. Adrian's shoulders stiffened again. No, do not send anything to the house. If Ethan opens one envelope before I have answers, he will assume the worst, and honestly. He stopped speaking for several seconds before finishing in an almost broken whisper. Honestly, after the way I have acted lately, I cannot even blame him. Tears rolled freely down my face. Every lonely dinner, every unanswered question, every sleepless night replayed inside my mind from an entirely different angle. None of it erased the hurt. None of it changed the months we had spent drifting apart. But for the first time since Noah was born, I could see that Adrian had been hurting too. The call finally ended. Adrian remained standing in the hallway with the phone hanging loosely at his side. He stared toward the nursery door as though he could somehow see Noah sleeping inside. Then he spoke so softly I almost missed it. I just need a little more time, he whispered into the empty house. Please do not give up on me before I can finally give both of you the life you deserve. Sleep never came that night. Noah rested peacefully in the portable crib beside me, breathing with the complete trust only a baby could have, while I sat on the edge of the bed replaying every word Adrian had spoken until sunrise painted pale streaks across the apartment window. I had spent months building a story in my head, one where I was slowly being left behind by the man I loved. Now that story had cracked wide open, revealing something far more complicated beneath it. Yet one question refused to leave me alone. If Adrian was trying so hard to protect us, why had he chosen silence instead of letting me stand beside him? The following morning I expected a text asking whether Noah and I had arrived safely at my mother's house. None came. Around 8:30 my phone finally vibrated. It was a simple message from Adrian. I hope you both slept well. Give Noah a hug for me. I stared at the screen for several seconds. There was no mention of missing us. No explanation. No clue that he had spent the previous evening talking to an empty nursery. My fingers hovered over the keyboard before I answered. He misses you already. 3 gray dots appeared almost instantly, then disappeared. They returned a few seconds later before vanishing again. Finally, one short reply arrived. Tell him I will make it up to him soon. I read those words over and over. He had written to Noah, not to me. A month earlier, I would have taken that as proof that I no longer mattered. Now I wondered if he simply believed he had lost the right to ask anything from me. Throughout the morning, I kept the monitor application open even though the nursery remained empty. Shortly before noon, another notification appeared. Motion detected. Adrian had come home unexpectedly. Instead of heading upstairs, he sat alone at the kitchen table. The camera could not show him, but the microphone carried every sound. I heard papers sliding across the table, followed by the click of a laptop opening. A few moments later, another voice entered the room. It belonged to a woman, calm and professional. "I brought everything you requested," she said. My entire body stiffened. Adrian answered quietly, "Thank you for meeting me here instead of the office." My imagination immediately tried to drag me back toward old fears, but I forced myself to listen instead of assume. "These are the revised numbers," the woman continued. "If the seller accepts your final offer, closing could happen before the end of next month." Papers shifted again. "That depends on whether the foundation repairs are completed on schedule." Adrian sighed. "As long as the place is safe for Noah, I can wait." The woman gave a gentle laugh. "You have mentioned your son in every meeting we have had." Adrian answered without hesitation. "Everything I am doing is because of my family." Silence settled briefly before she spoke again. "Have you told your husband any of this yet?" My heart nearly stopped. Adrian took longer to answer than I expected. "No. He deserves to know." "I know he does." Another long pause followed. "But if this deal falls apart again after I tell him, I will have raised his hopes for nothing. He has carried enough disappointment already." The woman sounded sympathetic. "Keeping all of this to yourself has not exactly protected him." Adrian released a tired breath. I realized that now. There was no defensiveness in his voice, only regret. Every night I come home planning to explain everything. Then I look at him holding Noah, and I think one more week will give me better news. One more week becomes another, and somehow I have forgotten how to start the conversation. I slowly covered my mouth to keep from crying aloud. The silence that had nearly destroyed our marriage had not been built from indifference. It had been built one postponed conversation at a time, each delayed by the hope that tomorrow would finally bring the ending Adrian wanted to give us. As the meeting continued, the woman gathered the documents and stood to leave. Before she reached the front door, she stopped and said something that lingered in my mind long after the call ended. "Do not wait until you have the perfect ending before you tell someone the truth. Sometimes the truth is exactly what saves the ending." The apartment suddenly felt too small to hold everything I had learned in less than 24 hours. I had come here believing I was collecting proof that my marriage was over. Instead, every hour seemed to uncover another piece of a truth I had never considered. Adrian had been making terrible decisions, but they were not the decisions I had accused him of making in my mind. He had chosen silence instead of partnership. He had mistaken protecting me for shutting me out, and I had mistaken his silence for the absence of love. Neither of us had meant to hurt the other, yet somehow we had spent months doing exactly that. Late that afternoon, while Noah napped peacefully beside me, my phone rang. Adrian's name appeared on the screen. For a long moment, I simply stared at it, wondering whether I was finally ready to hear his voice. I answered before it could go to voicemail. "Hi," I said quietly. There was a brief silence before Adrian spoke. "How is Noah?" It was such a familiar question that I almost smiled. "He is doing well. He just finished his bottle and fell asleep." "Good." Another pause settled between us, heavy but different from the awkward silences we had shared at home. This one felt uncertain rather than empty. "And how are you?" he finally asked. It was the first time in months that he had asked me that question without sounding distracted. I looked down at Noah's peaceful face. "I am still figuring that out." Adrian let out a slow breath. "I deserve that answer." I closed my eyes. Everything inside me wanted to ask about the house, the meetings, the paperwork, the phone calls, and every secret he had carried alone. Instead, I asked the only question that truly mattered. Did you miss us? The silence that followed lasted so long I wondered if the call had disconnected. Then I heard him inhale sharply. Every minute. His voice was almost unrecognizable. The house does not even sound the same without Noah laughing. Another pause. Without you. My heart ached. For months I had begged silently for those 2 words. Now that I finally heard them, they brought comfort and sadness at the same time, because they had arrived after so much unnecessary pain. Before I could respond, another phone beep interrupted him. Ethan, I am sorry. I have to take this. It is the contractor. That is okay, I answered softly. We can talk later. I would like that, he said, and the call ended. A few seconds later, curiosity overcame me. I opened the monitor application again. Adrian had forgotten that the kitchen microphone could still pick up nearby conversations. The familiar professional voice from earlier had returned, but this time another man joined the discussion. Good news, the man said. The foundation repairs passed inspection this morning. Adrian released a breath that sounded almost like a laugh. Are you serious? Completely serious. We can move forward with closing if you are still interested. There was a long pause before Adrian answered. More than ever. Papers rustled across the table. There is one more thing, the man continued. The builder agreed to include the fenced backyard at no additional cost. Adrian laughed quietly, and it was the first genuine laugh I had heard from him in months. Noah is going to love that. Then he added something that made tears fill my eyes all over again. Ethan will finally get his garden. He was still thinking about that tiny dream I had nearly forgotten myself. Not because tomatoes mattered, but because he remembered every little hope I had ever shared with him. In that single moment, I understood something I should have realized long ago. Love is not always measured by how loudly someone speaks. Sometimes it hides inside the plans they quietly build for your future, even when they foolishly believe carrying the burden alone is an act of kindness. But as I listened to Adrian thanking everyone for their help, another realization settled over me just as firmly. If we continued pretending everything was fine, this new beginning would collapse under the weight of the same old silence. Whatever happened next, one of us had to be brave enough to go home and finally tell the whole truth. The drive home felt longer than it had ever felt before, even though the apartment was less than 10 minutes away. Noah slept peacefully in the back seat, completely unaware that his parents had spent months standing on opposite sides of the same misunderstanding. My hands tightened around the steering wheel as I pulled into our driveway just after sunset. Every light inside the house was on. Adrian's car was already there. For several moments, I simply sat in silence, listening to Noah's gentle breathing through the baby mirror. I had imagined this conversation so many different ways over the past day. In some versions, I confronted him with everything I had heard. In others, I quietly pretended nothing had happened until he confessed on his own. Neither option felt right anymore. If I had learned anything, it was that secrets had already stolen enough from us. I lifted Noah from his car seat, balanced the diaper bag over my shoulder, and walked to the front door. Before I could reach for my keys, the door opened from the inside. Adrian stood there as though he had been watching the driveway from the living room window. His eyes immediately found Noah, then slowly met mine. Neither of us spoke. After what felt like an eternity, he quietly said, "You came home." I nodded once. I did. He stepped aside without another word. The familiar scent of fresh coffee and cedar filled the entryway. Nothing inside the house had changed, yet somehow everything felt different. Adrian closed the door behind us while I carried Noah into the living room and settled him onto his play mat with his favorite stuffed rabbit. Noah laughed happily the moment he saw both of us together, reaching his tiny hands toward Adrian without hesitation. Adrian knelt beside him, smiling through eyes that already looked dangerously close to tears. He gently picked Noah up, held him against his chest, and whispered, "I missed you more than you know." Watching them together broke something open inside me. I turned toward the kitchen before I lost my nerve. Can we talk? Adrian carefully kissed Noah's forehead before placing him in the high chair with a few soft toys to keep him occupied. Then he walked into the kitchen and stopped across from me at the island where we had shared hundreds of ordinary mornings together. This time, neither of us reached for coffee. Neither of us pretended everything was normal. Adrian spoke first. I owe you more apologies than I can count. I slowly shook my head. Before you apologize, I need to tell you something. His expression tightened with concern. Okay. I looked directly into his eyes. I never went to my mother's house. Confusion crossed his face. What do you mean? My voice trembled despite every effort to stay calm. I stayed nearby. I took a slow breath. I listened through Noah's baby monitor. The color drained from Adrian's face. He stared at me without speaking, processing every word. I continued before fear convinced me to stop. I heard you in the nursery. I heard the phone calls. I heard the meetings about the house. Silence filled the kitchen. It was not the cold silence that had haunted us for months. It was the stunned silence of two people realizing every hidden truth had finally reached the surface. Adrian lowered his eyes. I suppose I should be angry that you listened. He gave a sad smile that lasted only a second. But I cannot be, because I gave you every reason to believe something was wrong. I felt tears burning again. I thought you stopped loving me. He looked up so quickly that the answer came before I finished speaking. Never. His voice was steady, certain, and immediate. Not for 1 second. I swallowed hard. Then why did you make me feel so alone? Adrian rested both hands on the countertop as though trying to steady himself. Because I convinced myself that if I solved every problem before telling you, I would be protecting you. He slowly shook his head. Instead, I protected the problems and left you alone with your fears. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. In the next room, Noah laughed at one of his toys, the bright, innocent sound drifting into the kitchen like a reminder of everything we still had. Adrian's eyes followed the sound before returning to mine. I cannot change the months we lost, he said quietly. But if you are willing to listen, I promise there will never be another secret between us again. Adrian disappeared upstairs for a few moments before returning with a worn leather folder I had never seen before. He placed it gently on the kitchen island without opening it immediately, almost as though he was afraid the truth inside might still be too heavy to carry. Noah happily banged a plastic spoon against the tray of his high chair in the next room, filling the silence with cheerful little sounds that somehow made the conversation feel safer. Adrian slowly opened the folder and turned it toward me. Inside were inspection reports, mortgage estimates, renovation plans, medical payment statements, and handwritten notes covered in calculations. Tucked between them was a printed photograph of a small white house with a wide front porch, blue shutters, and a fenced backyard. I recognized it immediately from the brief description I had overheard. This is the house, Adrian said quietly. Or at least I hope it still will be. I picked up the photograph with trembling hands. The backyard stretched farther than I expected, with enough room for a swing set, a vegetable garden, and a large maple tree casting shade across the grass. You remembered the garden? I whispered. Adrian smiled sadly. You talked about it the first week we moved into this house. You said someday you wanted Noah to pick tomatoes that he grew with you. I laughed softly through tears. I never thought you actually remembered that. I remember almost everything you tell me. His answer hurt in the gentlest possible way because I realized I had spent months believing he no longer noticed me at all. He slid another paper toward me. It listed the unexpected medical expenses from Noah's birth, the insurance adjustments, and the additional overtime hours Adrian had accepted to rebuild our savings. I kept telling myself that if I worked a little harder, solved one more problem, or earned one more bonus, I could hand you a future instead of another burden, he admitted. I wanted the next chapter of our lives to begin with good news instead of more stress. I slowly looked up from the papers. Do you know what I wanted? He shook his head. I wanted you beside me on the couch after Noah fell asleep. I wanted you to tell me you were scared. I wanted to know that we were carrying the same weight together instead of pretending one of us was strong enough to carry all of it alone. Adrian lowered his eyes, and for a moment neither of us spoke. Then he quietly nodded. I forgot that marriage is supposed to divide the weight instead of hiding it. I reached across the counter and rested my hand over his. It was the first time we had touched without hesitation in what felt like forever. He looked at our hands as though he was afraid I might pull away. I did not. I made mistakes too, I said softly. Instead of telling you how frightened I was, I kept collecting evidence that my fears were true. Every late meeting became proof. Every quiet dinner became another reason to believe I was losing you. Adrian squeezed my hand gently. Then maybe we both stopped asking questions because we were afraid of the answers. I nodded, and we almost lost everything because of it. At that exact moment, Noah let out a delighted laugh from the living room. We both turned instinctively toward the sound. He had managed to drop his stuffed rabbit onto the floor and seemed endlessly entertained by the accomplishment. Adrian and I laughed together, the simple shared laughter feeling unfamiliar at first before settling into something wonderfully natural. Adrian walked over, picked up the rabbit, and handed it back to Noah, who immediately wrapped both tiny hands around it with complete confidence. Watching him, Adrian quietly said, "He never doubted we would both come back." I felt another wave of emotion rise inside me. Children did not understand mortgage paperwork, financial stress, or the damage silence could create. Noah only knew that when he reached out, he expected both of his parents to be there. I stood beside Adrian and looked down at our son. Then let us make sure he grows up in a home where love sounds louder than fear. Adrian turned toward me, his eyes shining with relief. "I cannot promise I will never make another mistake," he said honestly. "But I can promise I will never hide behind silence again." This time, when I believed him, it was not because his words were perfect. It was because for the first time in months, they matched the truth already waiting in his eyes. 6 months later, the first tomatoes finally survived. That was the thought that made me smile as I stood barefoot in the backyard on a warm Saturday morning, watching Noah wobble across the grass with determined little steps, while Adrian followed close behind with both hands ready, but never rushing to catch him unless he truly needed help. The white house with the blue shutters had become our home just before Thanksgiving. The maple tree that Adrian had described now stretched wide enough to shade nearly half the yard. And beside the fence stood 3 raised garden beds that looked far healthier than anything I had ever managed before. Adrian still liked to tease me that the secret was less about gardening and more about finally remembering to water the plants on time. He was probably right. Some evenings we laughed about how close we had come to letting fear write the ending of our story instead of honesty. Other evenings we simply sat together on the porch after Noah had fallen asleep, listening to crickets and talking about everything from grocery lists to dreams we had not dared to speak aloud for months. The conversations were rarely dramatic. They did not need to be. We had learned that ordinary honesty was far more powerful than perfect silence. Adrian no longer accepted extra work without discussing it with me first, and I stopped pretending I was fine whenever anxiety quietly found its way back into my thoughts. We made a simple promise to each other that neither of us would ever carry invisible burdens alone again. Sometimes that meant difficult conversations over cold coffee after midnight. Sometimes it meant admitting that one of us was overwhelmed before frustration had the chance to grow into distance. Neither approach was comfortable, but both were far kinder than allowing imagination to replace the truth. One afternoon, I found the old baby monitor while unpacking the final storage box in the garage. I held it in my hands for a long moment before bringing it inside. Adrian looked at it, smiled knowingly, and asked, "Are you thinking about throwing it away?" I slowly shook my head. No. I placed it on a shelf in the hallway closet instead. It reminded me of the night I finally heard the truth. Adrian walked over and wrapped one arm gently around my shoulders. "I wish I had given you the truth without making you search for it." I leaned against him with a quiet smile. And I wish I had asked one more question before assuming I already knew the answer. Noah crawled over at that exact moment, carrying one of his picture books upside down, proudly announcing something that sounded nothing like real words, but somehow made perfect sense to both of us. Adrian laughed, lifted him into his arms, and kissed the top of his head. Watching them together no longer filled me with questions. It filled me with gratitude. Not because our life had become perfect, but because it had become honest. There were still unexpected bills, sleepless nights when Noah caught a cold, unfinished home projects, and days when work followed Adrian through the front door. The difference was that none of those things had to be faced in silence anymore. Looking back, I realized the greatest misunderstanding in our marriage had never been about money, a new house, or long hours at the office. It had been believing that love could be proven only through sacrifice instead of shared vulnerability. Adrian thought protecting me meant carrying every burden alone. I thought protecting myself meant preparing for the worst before it could surprise me. We were both wrong, and yet we were fortunate enough to discover it before the distance became permanent. Every now and then I still watch Noah running beneath the maple tree with dirt on his little shoes and tomato leaves brushing against his tiny hands, and I think about how different our lives might have been if one quiet evening had unfolded another way. The lesson I carry with me is wonderfully simple. The people who love us most cannot comfort the fears we never speak aloud, and the strongest families are not the ones that never struggle. They are the ones that choose the truth before fear has the chance to tell the story for them.